So I've been noticing that I feel crazy sometimes, and I'm trying to differentiate two different things that are going on because it seems like there's two different moments of this kind of craziness, and the one is the one that I'm more familiar with as a scholar of trauma studies, which is these like watching these images come out of Sudan, DRC, Gaza that are so unimaginably horrifying that your capacity to kind of know what it is you're experiencing starts falling apart. And it's also something that I remember from my own youth of like seeing stuff happen politically in South Africa. I'm seeing kind of acts of extreme violence and going into this state of kind of shock of not being able to think clearly about it. And that I'm really familiar with. But the last 2 years, I've been noticing more and more a different kind of craziness that is not that. And it's much more subtle than that. It doesn't come as a kind of a devastating, visceral, physical shock. It comes as this weird feeling that something something in the room where everyone is like us here, we're thinking about something, we're talking about something. There's something wrong with it. There's something really, really profoundly wrong with it. And I've noticed myself feeling like this when people talk about things in certain ways. Like not only, as I said, the scenes from DRC, Sudan, Gaza, but the way in which people do or don't talk about them sometimes gives me another kind of crazy feeling. And so the work that I've been doing is to make sense of that and say, how can we differentiate and conceptualize that that moment? Not the first moment, which I kind of understand quite well. And so I'm going back to the person who started this all, um, Judith Herman, the person who started my journey in understanding a kind of a political study of trauma. And here's a quote from her seminal book. And of course, if you haven't read that, you should leave the meeting right now and go and read it because your life is going will change. Even though the book's 30 years old now, it's still one of the I'd put this next to The Wretched of the Earth. This is the seminal books that have changed my life. Okay. She says, the ordinary response to atrocities is to banish them from consciousness. Certain violations of the social compact are too terrible to utter aloud. This is the meaning of the word unspeakable. Atrocities are ever refused to be buried. As powerful as the desire to deny atrocities is the conviction that denial does not work. Folk wisdom is filled with ghosts who refuse to rest in their graves until their stories are told. Murder will out. Remembering and telling the truth about terrible events are prerequisites both for the restoration of the social order and for the healing of individual victims. And in one sense, I want to apply this Herman quote to a kind of a crazy making bureaucratic situation that I find myself in at the moment. So what I'm concerned about, the object of the analysis today, is this idea that the concept of trauma has become a kind of cultural concept that is evolved out of kind of a clinical psychological concept to be this kind of multifaceted cultural tool that is being deployed by different people to talk about different things and to understand different things. And what I'm really worried about is it seems that in this migration into culture, something catastrophic is happening to the idea of trauma, which I feel protective over the idea of trauma. And I'm watching something bad happening to it. Um, and I want to try and explain what I think it is that's happening. Okay. And so I'm testing out some concepts that I'm going to talk about today. So I'm just going to list them just so you can watch them happen. The idea of asymmetrical validation, the idea of repressive inclusion, and at the core of the title of this talk, this idea of transformative discomfort. And of course, this terrible thing happened to me. I've been working on this concept for a really long time. And then I mean, this is every PhD student's nightmare, right? I found out that Michalinos Zembylas had already mapped the whole thing for a decade. Like the work was done. I was wasting my time. And if you don't know Zembylas's work, it's absolutely fantastic. You should bring him here as a matter of urgency because I think he's at MMU at the moment. Yeah. Um, and so that, and he has a concept very similar to what I'm thinking about when I think about transformative discomfort. And then I'm digging back into my roots as a person who never really became a psychologist, even though I taught in psychology departments. Okay, very classic formal psychological concept of window of tolerance as it applies to trauma study. So that's the conceptual framework. Okay. And my work is about social justice. My work is to map the field of social justice and try and turn it into kind of core curriculum that we can have consensus about. And so I'm interested when I use the notion of trauma. I'm not interested in from a clinical point of view. I'm interested, well, I am, but I'm not primarily interested. I'm interested from a social justice point of view. And I'm interested as part of its cultural misappropriation how trauma has the notion of trauma, and specifically for the purpose of this talk, the notion of trauma-informed practice. It isn't such a big thing in South Africa, but in the US, in Australia, places like that, trauma-informed practice has become a corporate buzzword. It's become part of marketing and branding in a way that I'm very worried about. I don't think this is a healthy development. It has some inspiration that is positive, but I'm very concerned. And so what I think is happening is that the notion of trauma-informed practice, the notion that we should be thinking about the harms caused by certain experiences, has been kind of sucked up into neoliberal managerialism. I'm not even going to unpack that for you. That's another hour. On the one hand, a kind of philosophy of management that has become, unfortunately, the philosophy of management of universities. It's now become the way in which universities are run, which it never used to be and shouldn't be. And it also sort of plays out somewhere else, which is what I've called self-help populism. And this is that thing like when you walk into a bookshop, there's this whole like section of these kind of Californian books, like affirming like this idea of somehow manufacturing yourself as a kind of a healthy, well-adjusted subject of late capitalism. And I'm enough of a Frankfurt School person to be very suspicious of that project. Okay. So what I want to talk about is how trauma-informed practice has been misappropriated and isn't about people getting harmed anymore. What it's about now is about corporate risk management. It's become a managerial term that people invested in the kind of branding of corporations, including the branding of universities, and the idea that universities are in fact properly thought about as brands, not as public educational resources, in this kind of neoliberal system. And so I'm worried about that. And then I'm not even more worried, I'm as worried about something else, which is the way in which a version of trauma-informed practice has become co-opted by conservative politics, and particularly a kind of an American version of conservative politics, which is not like, fiscal conservatism. It's about it's about the culture wars. It's about it's about people getting upset that the world is changing and trying to turn the clock back in a particular kind of a way. And the way that Trumpism is about trying to make the 1950s before the whole kind of human rights revolution happened in the United States. And so we reached this extraordinary point in history where trauma-informed practice is actually being used to bolster up the rise of a kind of a global neo-Nazi white supremacist movement, and it's being used to provide the conditions of possibility of genocide, which is just, to me, a mind-boggling and catastrophic world to be in as a scholar of trauma studies. And that's the second kind of madness that I was talking about. Is like, this is crazy what is going on. Is like how this concept that had this kind of liberatory edge has become has become a part of a kind of ideologies and social practices of violence. Okay. And so what's happening is trauma-informed practice is being mobilized to try and prevent social critique and social change and moves towards social equality. And I want to explain how I think about that. Okay, but before we do that, at the risk of being really patronizing, I want to get to the absolute foundations of what we mean by trauma-informed practice. I don't want to take that for granted at all. So bear with me if you are a scholar in this field and this seems very high school. There's a reason I want to cover the basics, because I think they've become distorted so badly. Okay, so the first principle of trauma studies is that negative experiences that people have negative reactions to experiences, that experience impact profoundly emotionally on people. And not only that, but the way in which they impact profoundly on people then carries through in those people into other situations. So it becomes a kind of it becomes a thing that influences the experience of the rest of the social world. Okay. And secondly, something that I thought we all took for granted, but I've been proven wrong in the last 2 or 3 years, is that we shouldn't harm each other. Like, the first principle of medicine and research is first do no harm. And apparently not everyone agrees with that. So when trauma-informed practice, when this idea of experiences having negative impact and that we should avoid doing harm gets taken out of both a kind of a social justice orientation and into a corporate brand management context, that's where this shift becomes interesting. Okay, so the key assumptions there: we can avoid uh, doing harm by avoiding unnecessary exposure to distressing experiences. This is like the one thing that we kind of almost agree on, me and the neoliberal psychopaths of late capitalism, for want of a better word. That we can positively mitigate the impact of experiences by providing support, and that we can also enhance people's capacity at dealing with those difficult experiences. And in doing that, we can then sort of create a system where we can provide social models that are protective of people and create more protective social systems using this idea of trauma-informed practice. But that's not what's happening across the board. Okay, so one of the reasons I think it's not happening is because an important differentiation has been collapsed, and I want to reassert the differentiation, although not too kind of programmatically, not too much in terms of a binary, but I want to look at the difference between distress and discomfort on the one hand and trauma on the other hand. and say, well, what's the difference between not liking something and being traumatized by something? Because I think we might have forgotten what that difference is. Okay, and one of the main differences is the main between something being uncomfortable or distressing and it being traumatic is when the thing that's making you upset goes away, you feel better. It's literally as simple as that. It's like something makes you upset, but when it's not there anymore, there's a kind of automatic process of going back to ordinariness. Whereas the key force of trauma as an analytic and clinical concept is about why impacts continue through time in people. Okay. And so I want to really reassert the difference between discomfort and trauma. I also want to say something that I think seems to have gotten lost somewhere is that both distress and trauma can be both positive and negative. We assume that these things are purely negative. And that's one of my big works today, is to push back against that and to say, in fact, that neither distress nor trauma are necessarily only negative. Um, and although they're dangerous, they can cause very, very serious harms. There's other things that can happen also. Um, and one of the things that is interesting, and which I think is why AVRIC exists, um, is that distress and trauma can also motivate us to change the reality that we live in, which is, I think, why the center exists, which I think at a certain level is why social sciences and humanities exist, because there are things that are not okay, and us knowing that they are not okay and feeling that they are not okay and sitting with those feelings is actually absolutely critical to any project of transformation. And I think that might have been the thing that fell off the cliff in the shift to this kind of managerial thinking. Okay, so okay, making the same point. We don't automatically recover from trauma. It can lead to a whole lot of things. I'm not going to go through all of this because this is quite sort of just clinical stuff of explaining reactions to trauma. But to identify that even within the clinical practice, the notion of post-traumatic growth is an important concept. And also, I don't want to get too kind of effusive about it because I think there's a potential scam in the notion of post-traumatic growth, which becomes a kind of a victim blaming insistence on recovery that is actually very persecutory. Nevertheless, I think that there's a kernel of truth in it that people can develop heightened sensitivities, they can develop an orientation towards certain kinds of transformative action that we need to hold on to without getting into a kind of Californian kind of persecutory kind of heal or be damned kind of approach. So what is trauma-informed practice? Trauma-informed practice is just understanding how distress and trauma work and to actively work towards limiting harm on the one hand and on the other side supporting positive transformation. Okay, what is it that trauma-informed practice is not? Because this is really my object of concern. Okay, the assumption within the model that I've been talking about seems to me that trauma-informed practice is about making sure people don't have challenging experiences. And that seems to be the corporate managerial idea of it, that we must stop people having challenging experiences. And I'm here today specifically to be the person who says, no, that is a mistake. And then, as soon as it's done that, it starts being something else, which is the really sinister and pernicious thing that I'm trying to map, which is as soon as it's become people shouldn't have bad experiences, it immediately becomes that people in power shouldn't have experiences that challenge their privilege, that make them have to critically reflect and become uncomfortable with their privilege and the forms of harm that are embedded in it. And it's that slippage from trauma to feeling good that that I think we need to talk about. Okay, so pedagogical practice. Being in university teaching, what does this mean? What does it mean to be a trauma-informed academic, a trauma-informed teacher, trauma-informed student? And I want to contrast two kind of very different things briefly. The one is kind of really big and growing field of climate science in the context of apocalyptic climate catastrophe. So on the surface of it, climate science is just a part of proper science, not the stuff we do, the stuff real scientists do with actual facts. Um, and so climate, you can say that, teaching climate science is just about teaching the facts, teaching the numbers, teaching the measurements, showing how the projections are generated, or all of that kind of stuff. So it's purely a domain of communicating scientific knowledge. But what we've noticed within climate science is there's this entire trauma syndrome amongst climate scientists who are just falling apart in a really serious way. Because what climate science, what the sort of projections of climate science are apocalyptic in a way that perhaps nothing else has ever been apocalyptic outside kind of sort of religious mythological accounts of apocalypse. Okay, of kind of species ending catastrophe. And the problem for climate scientists is that they aren't social scientists like us. So they've been told that to be a scientist is to be objective, to be emotionally uninvolved, to be, to have a relation to your material that is not a human relation. It's a relation to abstract knowledge, and this has made them uniquely vulnerable to this kind of traumatic syndrome where there's a relation between the facts and the end of the world, and that they don't know how to think about that because they don't know how to feel about that. Um, in, so within that context, we see three of these bureaucratic solutions happening. The one is a non-trauma informed reaction, which is just to say we just don't talk about that. We stick with the facts, and if you start falling apart and crying and not being able to be a climate scientist anymore, that's just because you're a bad scientist. You're an unprofessional scientist, and you shouldn't be a scientist because you're bad at it. Okay, that's a non-trauma informed approach. There's something else which I think is even more alarming to me than that, which is a badly trauma informed approach. Okay, um, which is to say, well, this stuff is freaking people out. It's freaking out our best, most productive researchers who are getting our grants and our Nobel Prizes, and it's freaking out our students. And we can't have that. So we must stop teaching climate science. The trauma-informed response is to say, take it off the table. It's too upsetting for everyone. So we're not going to do climate science anymore, and we're not going to work out what the problems are and how to solve them. We're just going to vanish them away from reality by vanishing them away from our consciousness. Okay? And that's the thing I've been watching happen more and more, is this kind of bad trauma-informed or anti-trauma-informed approach. Okay? As opposed to a trauma-informed approach, which is to rethink how we do climate science. Okay, to rethink what are we doing when we be scientists? Like, what is that process? To what extent has the notion of science coming out of a kind of a history of notions of objectivity? To what extent is that actually bad science because it doesn't position us to work precisely in a field where affect and knowledge are completely enmeshed with each other? Okay. Um, so to do trauma-informed climate science is to rethink those distinctions, and to resituate ourselves as kind of as people with feelings, with fears, with anxieties, and so the whole field of climate emotion has become this rapidly emerging field. And I want to use that example precisely because it's out of science versus another example, which is more familiar to most of us, which is the field of sexual violence. And many of us work in gender-based violence, sexual violence, those kinds of fields. And there's a kind of obvious recognition in these fields that this stuff is going to be upsetting. So we are better positioned because out the door we are told, look, this may be upsetting. Okay, so there's an acknowledgement of the possible negative impacts. And we can see why it would be risky for two different reasons. One, it's risky for people who have experienced those forms of violence and harm themselves, and for whom those exposure to those ways of thinking and that information is personally triggering. And that's often one of the most recognized in popular culture notions of trauma, is the idea of a traumatic trigger, the way in which something then invokes the unresolved, unprocessed negative emotion around original trauma. But there's another thing which I think is really interesting, which is a similar problem to the climate science problem, is even for people who are not survivors of those forms of violence, just finding out how shit people really are and what kind of terrible things they systematically do to each other while walking around in ties and living apparently normal life. There's something traumatic about that. There's something traumatic about having one's illusions about society, about about the communities we live in, about the people who are our friends and our family members, finding out something else about them that is very, very, very disturbing. So, and that doesn't depend on having had the personal experience. It simply depends on having the imaginative capacity for empathy and for understanding systemic harms. And often we address that less. We address the conceptual trauma less than we address trigger trauma. The fact that just knowing certain things about the nature of people and the world is traumatic. And that's what climate scientists are realizing. They're both realizing that this is the kind of double trauma within climate science at the moment. Firstly, that something terrible is coming down the track historically. And secondly, that no one's doing anything about it. That there's the historical potential for it not to be catastrophic is there, but the people who could make a difference do not care. The people who are becoming billionaires from from the system that is creating those risks don't mind ending the existence of the human race. In fact, they're building rockets to go to Mars and things precisely to deal with that problem. Okay, so whoa, I'm jumping ahead of myself. So what do we do in the face of the traumatic risks of studying sexual violence? Okay, once again, don't study it. Just take it off the table. Don't do stuff that upsets people. It's off brand for the corporate risk aversion of university managers. Okay, or cover it in a kind of in a detached way, in an academic way, in a professional way. And I've talked elsewhere about the notion of toxic professionalism, the way in which the idea of being professional is an idea of not being vulnerable, and the complex way in which that's gendered, and becomes a kind of a trap for women in academic spaces, having to kind of perform a masculine style invulnerability to erase the kind of sexist notions that they don't have the capacity for to not be overwhelmed by emotion. So there's kind of like weird other kind of gaslighting, victimization going on there. Okay, so to cover it without the feelings, to just talk about the facts, present the facts without engagement. Don't address the parts where thinking and feeling become inseparably enmeshed. Okay, and that's the kind of what I called in the previous example the anti-trauma informed way, but it's the dominant corporate way of doing things at the moment. And the final, with the trauma informed way, is to say, in fact, one has to simultaneously engage the analytic the structural understanding of what is happening and the emotional impacts of that and of knowing about that, the emotional impact of knowing, which is kind of a theme for the forthcoming conference in a way. Um, so what trauma-informed practice means in that situation is actually paying specific attention as a core learning project, of focusing on the emotional process, and not just focusing on it to note that it is happening, but focusing on it in a pedagogical and developmental way, where one of the core outcomes of working in this field is to increase people's capacity to work with those kind of challenges. Because one of the things we know historically, people who work in family violence, gender violence areas, is that they go crashing into this field, into community activism, into various things, and rapidly burn out and leave. The number of people who sustain that kind of engagement is actually quite small, precisely because the capacity to work in a sustained way with that kind of emotional duress was not one of the core skills that they were taught in their training. They were taught other skills. They were taught about law. They're taught about psychological techniques of intervention, but not the core capacity to manage being in situations that are continuously horrific and the abrasive effect that has on us. Okay, so here I'm getting to the fight, my personal line in the sand around trauma studies. And it's to talk about the way in which this notion of trauma-informed practice has become weaponized. Because for most of us who are of a certain age, who come out of a certain activist tradition, developing an articulate language of victimization was absolutely critical to our intellectual work and to our political work. Being able to talk about what is wrong in the world around us, in the ways in which society is organized. But having developed those tools are now up for grabs for anyone to start making use of, not people out of that particular trajectory, okay? Not only that, but those tools are even more available to people who are in positions of power, people who can control the articulation and dissemination of ideas in the social world. Okay, so there's this inherent risk, which is not a risk, it is an actuality that we've been watching now, is that structurally advantaged groups reframe reframe trauma discourse to serve their own ends rather than to serve socially transformative ends. And what they're specifically doing in certain contexts, like in the US culture wars, okay, is to rearticulate their own feelings of discomfort and to associate those with traumatic harm, okay? And the outcomes of this is a very, very active politics. And we see it very clearly in the United States. The last few years in the United States, there's been this massive attack on certain kinds of inquiry. Okay, so literally studying critical race theory, decolonial theory, has been banned in states in the United States, banned from school, banned from university. You can now have your lecturers fired for looking at those things, for teaching gender studies, and 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 it's a kind of apocalyptic situation, which weirdly it seems people don't know how to talk about. The only way they're talking about it in terms of freedom, academic freedom. You can't censor academics. That is not really getting at the process that is happening here. Okay, and so this is a very brief extract from a list of words that the Trump regime has banned from government and research. So look at these words. If you use any of these words in your research projects, then you're excluded from like government funding, and the policy papers or whatever you develop cannot be considered. And really, obviously, subversive communist social order threatening words like anti-racist, biases, cultural, disability, diversity, gender, female. Like literally, like there's now a taboo on research that uses like gender specifying terms. Of course, the hate object of the Republican culture war was intersectionality. And my favorite word, trauma. That is, the government does not approve of trauma research or trauma related social services. Victims, women. How the hell did that happen? I mean, how the hell did we get to a situation where, like, the leader of the free world decided that this is intolerable knowledge, that this knowledge must be erased? And I don't think we have freaked out about this nearly enough. I don't think we've understood how serious this is. And I don't think we've understood how how it became justified. Once again, it's like, oh, but you must leave us alone. Researchers and academics must be free. That's not the issue. Something else is going on here. And what's going on is that people in power are mobilizing the idea of trauma and of trauma-informed practice to weaponize their bad feelings. Okay. So then I come to one of the punchlines in the talk, which are bad feelings are good. Okay. And this is the big pushback, is the assumption on the corporate model of trauma-informed practices, people mustn't have bad feelings. Okay. That white supremacists mustn't feel bad about the history of slavery and racism that is structural to Western society, and incel dudes on the internet mustn't feel bad that women don't want to date them. Like, these are really bad feelings, and people mustn't have bad feelings, so we must stop this critical race theory and this gender studies because making people feel bad. Okay. And so my response to that is bad is good. Okay. People must have bad feelings. It is absolutely essential for society to work and for people to develop as human beings to have bad feelings. These are not things to be switched off, erased, and they are especially not things to be switched off and erased by the elites in the most powerful positions in society. Okay, so avoiding bad feelings is the mechanisms by which people remain unaware of the structural harm they are causing. Okay, so it's like American Republicans don't want to talk about slavery in America. They don't want to. They want any history of kind of feminist and lesser patriarchy. The patriarchy. They want that to just go away because they feel funny in their tummy when people talk about that thing. And so that's got to stop because we mustn't have bad feelings. But if you don't have bad feelings, then the state of unawareness of the harms that your own life produces in the world continues. Okay. It's precisely the kind of critical reflection that we do in social sciences and humanities that makes it that makes it possible to understand the implications of our own lives. And it's only in that moment of understanding the implications of our own lives that we start having a kind of agency. Or I don't know what's going on there. That we start being able to make choices about it. We start understanding the world enough to be able to make decisions about it, and we start being able to make ethical choices about ourselves and our relation to the world. Okay, and that is why became an academic, if I didn't believe that, if I didn't believe in the capacity of humanities and social sciences to do the specific thing of making people aware of the bad stuff, then I wouldn't have done this. I wouldn't have wasted my life doing this nonsense. So, uh, okay, I don't have the ability to change the slides anymore.
Next.
That does nothing now. Do you want to help us out?
Okay. Try it again.
Okay, yep. So this is where I get mainstream psychological on you. Okay, so bad feelings are good, yes, within certain contexts and certain limits. I'm not saying let's make everyone life hellish. Um, and uh, and this is where the two concepts come into being. The notion of transformative discomfort. There are some kinds of discomfort that are transformative and some that are not. And what is the difference between some kind of bad feelings that are transformative and bad feelings that are just horrible and lock stuff in place and cause people to react in negative, even more destructive ways, because it can go either way. Um, and that's the thing we need to understand, and that as educators is the thing that we need to really get a handle on, is the difference between destructive bad feelings and transformative bad feelings. And this is what I'm talking about when I talk about transformative discomfort. How do we create in the learning process and in our social worlds the conditions for discomfort to become socially transformative? Okay, and one of the ways we do it is the psychological idea of window of tolerance. Okay, the idea that we exist we try to exist in this kind of middle space between either being kind of traumatically overwhelmed by stuff or being dissociated from it, having no relation, saying, well, I'm not going to have that feeling, so I'm just going to not know. I'm going to not feel, I'm not going to not think, I'm going to be intellectually ignorant, emotionally dissociated, not going to have feelings on the one side, versus I'm going to immerse myself so thoroughly in this, which is a real risk that many of us face because it's our work. We're doing it every day, that I'm going to become overwhelmed in a way that is just going to eventually destroy me. But in between those two extremes is a space of window of tolerance. The way where the bad feelings are there, but they can be worked with. They don't have to be magicked away, and neither do they have to be allowed to destroy us. And so there's a whole kind of therapeutics of how you how you widen the window of tolerance. Okay. And what worries me is that this is well understood in clinical practice and it's not well understood in pedagogical practice. That the project of widening a window of tolerance is something that people like me, whose job is teaching, just are not thinking about enough. And how would we do that in this kind of advanced intellectual space? Okay, so how much time have I got? I don't like this part of the talk, but this is part of the talk where I would give you practical advice. I hate practical advice, but I know it's really useful to other people. So if you want it, I'll give it. And the reason I don't like practical advice is because, once again, it gets used in a certain way. It gets used as a formula, it gets used as a rubric. And it's like, well, if we follow these steps, then the problem is solved. And and it becomes a kind of an unthinking pedantry, a box checking exercise, which is just like the death of the soul in a certain way. And it becomes anti trauma informed. But I'll give you 2 minutes of it. Okay. So one of the things we do in this kind of strategy is we plan curriculum in a certain way. Firstly, acknowledging that it will have different impacts on different people, and most of all, acknowledging that we don't know what those impacts are. They are not predictable. We can't say, oh, if students read this thing, they will have this reaction, because some of them will have that reaction, some of them will have no reaction, and some of them will have completely different reactions. It's the unpredictability of traumatic triggers, their specificity to each person's psychological and social history. That means we're working in a chaotic field of unpredictability, but we can build into our practice the idea that different people will have different reactions, and that some of those reactions will be intolerably negative in a way that both harmful to the person and undermines their learning trajectory. Okay. And so then the kind of corporate formula nonsense where you said, oh, you've got to start everything with a trigger warning. And yes, you must have a content notification. You must say, look, we will be covering this. We'll be looking at racial violence, violence against children, why capitalism is going to destroy the world as we know it and the human species. You can have trigger warnings about all of that stuff. Okay. But that's not the point. That is simply to create the conditions of informed consent, which all of us should be doing every day. Um, we need to be doing something much more than that, more than creating a situation where students can say, well, I want to do this. I want to do this part of the course, but not that part of the course. I want to be assessed on this. I don't want to be assessed on that. We've got to create structural alternatives that are normal in our practice. Okay. And we've got to ensure the other thing that the kind of corporate take on this is that we've got to have support services. We've got to have student counseling services. We've got to refer people to psychological services. And of course, one of the other big things we've got to do is a kind of normalizing psychoeducation, which is to say, we've got to tell students that this is part of learning. Tell them that the kind of radical emotional ruptures are an ordinary part of certain kinds of learning. And I remember so clearly the first time in a second year lecture on violence at UKZN, I started crying in the middle of the lecture, and I was freaked out because the thing that made me cry was so upsetting to me. And then I was freaked out that I was crying because academics are not supposed to cry. And I was like, oh shit. And I was very disoriented and very panicky. And I was like, well, I've got to pull this back, okay? And I've got to get professional again in this room, and I've got to get on with the pedagogical project of this content for a bit. And then I actually watched what was happening in the room, and it was really interesting. Everyone was relieved. And I was like, that is not what's supposed to be happening. Everyone is supposed to be like worried, annoyed, and they weren't. They were relieved because they had been freaking out also. And what I was doing is modeling not being freaked out. I was performing for them as an academic, that the proper way to be an academic is to not have those emotions. And that was a kind of radical act of violence against my students, is to embody that. And the moment I stopped, unintentionally kind of failed, and started being a person, was the moment everyone else was like, oh, thank God. Like, thank God someone else is freaking out about this nightmare that we're thinking through at the moment. Okay. And I've thought about that a lot since that moment. And that kind of the thinking I've done about that moment is kind of what is now, literally 20 years later, led me to this talk. Um, and and what does it mean? What does it mean to rupture those systems in a way that normalizes appropriate catastrophic human reactions in our educational process? Okay. So what do we do then? We just do what we're good at. We just explain. We just explain stuff. We explain what that reaction was. We say like, oh, wow, this has freaked me out, and this is why, and this is why it's significant for my personal history, and this is the kind of emotional reaction people have under these kind of psychological stresses. And we psychoeducate and we normalize, which is just basic kind of crisis psychotherapy. But we can do it in the classroom, okay? And then we do what I did by accident is we model that. We model being a non-dissociated human in a social space, a human who actually gets overtaken by the world and reactions to it. And we provide students with both a model of social practice and the intellectual scaffolding to be able to do that to themselves. Okay, and when we do that, we do two things. We widen their window of tolerance because it becomes possible to have disruptive things going on, but to be able to think at the same time, because that's the danger, is that when the stuff becomes overwhelming, we can no longer think. So to be on the verge of being overwhelmed, but be able to think at the same time. That's a really critical, I just hate this term so much, soft skill, okay? Like, that is a hard skill, okay? That is the ultimate transferable life skill that we can give our students beyond any subject content we could offer them. And at the same time, we do something else. And this is what I was really taken by in that moment. We create a community of practice. Because in the moment that I did that, like everyone was having reactions, and I could see one of the things a lot of the students wanted to do is they wanted to look after me. And that was very emotional for me because I'd never anticipated that as an educational relationship. I'd never imagined that my students cared about me. Like they thought I was clever, but I didn't. But I didn't think they cared about me as a person who was struggling to live. And by giving them permission to care about me and then to care about each other, we immediately transformed into a community of practice where everyone was caring about everyone else in the room. And everyone was acknowledging that we were all at emotional risk. And they were all rising to a social practice of engaging with that. And that's what we want to do. We want to create both the personal window of tolerance that makes things more manageable and the collective community practice that fundamentally changes our social relations, but also makes windows of tolerance more wider because it is precisely supportive social networks rather than hostile or dissociated social networks that close the window of tolerance and make difficult experiences unmanageable. It is by isolating. This is one of the worst things about traumatic experiences. It's not the terror, the helplessness, all of that. It's the social alienation that often follows them. It's the imaginative incapacity of the rest of the world to relate to your experience and for you to have a language to communicate with them and an expectation of being understood by them. That's a kind of harm that we are reenacting in our classrooms, okay? And it's got to stop. Silence is violence. So this corporate risk management thing that I hate so much is precisely about erasing that moment of distress. Is saying, well, we can't have that. And I literally was in a teaching and learning seminar last year where someone teaching a subject on family violence said, okay, now the first thing you have to establish as a rule when you're teaching family violence, gender-based violence, violence against children, is that students are not allowed to disclose personal experience in class. You remember talking that at the beginning of the talk, talked about the second type of feeling crazy. I felt really crazy listening to that from one of my colleagues. Like, what are you saying? What are you saying that we have a rule of non-disclosure in a field that is absolutely about the necessity of people learning to individually and collectively manage their most difficult emotions? This is crazy talk, but it's normal talk. It is the talk of university brand managers and legal risk advisors. Okay. Um, and what it does is it harms the students in exactly the way that the post-traumatic harm that I was talking about. Is it makes people who need to connect their experience to the world around them. It is a second act of victimization. It is a re-traumatization by telling them no. To be a professional in this area means to shut that shit down. You cannot be a in training professional and have those feelings and acknowledge those feelings and express those feelings. And this is apocalyptically wrong to me. It's not just a mistake. This is catastrophic. And this is where I get this like mad feeling like, what are you people talking about? You can't actually believe that. Okay. Then, of course, okay, so we're saying that prevents students from learning how to manage distressing experience in themselves and others, prevents them becoming insightful, skilled, empathic, blah, 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 trauma-informed professionals. But then the next step is, by doing that silencing, you hand over our hard-won critical tools for talking about these things, and you give them to the agents of violence in society. You say, okay, that whole language of having bad feelings, that can become the language of like white supremacists, of kind of men who are heavily invested in patriarchy, of people who have economic investments in horrific wars, um, and and we see this, and I mean, and one of the ways I've seen it really horrifically, I've been in Australia now, the last while, is Gaza. Okay, so now the first live stream genocide in human history. And I don't know about you, but my social media feeds are a nightmare. And and so people are like, students were like, oh, we're going to have a demonstration on campus, and people are protesting in town. And the progressive Labour government comes out and says, don't do that. That is, you are disrupting social cohesion when you do that. When you say, don't bomb children in Gaza, you're disrupting social cohesion because there are people who have funny feelings when you say that. When you say from the river to the sea, there are people who feel very uncomfortable and feel like they're not welcome there. And the astounding thing that I cannot comprehend is the equivalence of hundreds of thousands of people having their lives destroyed in a genocide and the feelings of middle class suburban people like, oh, that makes us uncomfortable when you talk about that. That these are being posited as existing on the same kind of ontological level in our reality. And that's where I feel the second kind of crazy. They are not the same kind of bad feeling. And Trump saying you're not allowed to do critical race theory in schools anymore, and the Labour government in Australia saying, well, you can't protest the genocide in Gaza, and the fact that we are supplying parts for the F-16 fighter bombers that are have destroyed now, have destroyed that part of human history and society. And that's the point I'm trying to make. The point is that if we get the meaning of being trauma informed wrong, and we allow the co-optation of this language to say, oh no, but social cohesion. But if you have someone with a little watermelon brooch in the classroom, that's going to make other students uncomfortable. So we're going to have to make a rule against that. That 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 is like the worst kind of nightmare for me as a trauma study scholar to create those conditions and say, well, the goal that being trauma informed means making sure everyone doesn't have bad feelings, and by everyone we mean the privileged people, and the people who are not privileged, well, they're not even human enough to be thought of as having feelings at all. They can just disappear from history. But the people in our privileged environment, our colleagues, we don't make our colleagues uncomfortable while they're having tea with us. Um, so no, that's that's my line in the sand as a trauma scholar, is to come here today and say, no, that's it. I'm not on board with that project. And I hope I've made that make some kind of sense today. Thanks.